Hello, I'm Sally Hogg, and this is the Mobilise podcast from the Centre for Research on Play in Education, Development and Learning at the University of Cambridge. Mobilise is a mini-series in which I talk to leading policymakers and politicians from across the UK about how research can be used in policy to improve children's lives. We'll be finding out about the things our guests have achieved for children and about the challenges that arise when trying to use research-based evidence in complex political environments. If you've got any interest in research, child development and children's policy, then this is a podcast for you. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Baroness Beverley Hughes. Beverley's a Labour politician who's worked at all levels of our political system as a local councillor, a minister in national government and deputy mayor in Greater Manchester. Before entering politics, Beverley was a probation officer and a university researcher, so she's got experience of research, policy and practice. Beverley had a wide range of roles in national government, but most relevant to this podcast is her time as Minister for Children, Young People and Families, a role which she held from 2005 to 2009. Beverley was Children's Minister at a seminal time in UK children's policy. In the early 2000s, there were huge efforts through the Every Child Matters agenda to coordinate policies relating to children and families at a local and national level. Beverley had a cross-government role with responsibilities for many policies related to children and young people that cut across government departments. And unlike most past and present children's ministers, she had a seat at the cabinet table. Beverley oversaw the development and growth of many important children's policies, including the expansion of Sure Start and childcare entitlements, the hugely successful teenage pregnancy policy, and concerted cross-government efforts to tackle child poverty. Hi Beverley, it's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you, Sally. It's lovely to see you again.
So let's start just by reflecting on all of that time you spent in government and as Children's Minister. A lot was achieved during that time. Can you tell us just what you're proudest of looking back?
I think you've probably mentioned some of them. I mean, Sure Start have to stand out because during my time it translated from a centrally driven local programme in about 400 areas, which obviously with that number we could keep control of centrally, and it had to transition in order to develop the ambition of 3,500 Sure Starts right across the country. In order to be able to do that, we had to move to another model. We couldn't control 3,500 centres from the centre, so it had to translate into a locally driven, a locally determined, managed programme. And that was difficult. And I know that a lot of people who were very passionate about Sure Start and had been involved in it from the outset were very, very concerned that transition would inevitably result in some dilution of the main principles and how they were put into practice. And that did turn out to be the case in some areas, but there was just no other way we could do it. But actually, by almost the end of my time, March 2009, I left government in the summer of that year. We had achieved the target number of Sure Start centres, and I think that was hugely satisfying for me to think that we had established this very extensive network of multi-agency centres for not just for children, and that's important, but for children and their families, their parents particularly. So that's one that stands out. I think the other, and this is because there was a political backdrop, I think, for this, for me, was the production of the Green Paper, Youth Matters, and then the following 10-year strategy, Aiming High for Young People. And that's important to me because I just felt that hitherto, and necessarily, the Labour government had taken a particular approach in terms of young people that was very much conditioned in people's mind by the respect agenda and the focus on young people as the perpetrators of antisocial behaviour, and that kind of coloured people's views for a long time. I really wanted to change that and to have in parallel with that, because I think that was an important programme. It was important for communities that they saw the government recognising some of the problems that there were there with antisocial behaviour. But I felt that we also needed another narrative, and that was about the potential of young people about the need to recognise that potential and to support them in terms of their development, just as we wanted to support the very youngest children. So that was very important to me. And I remember arguing the case in Cabinet for that and got approval for that. So I think that was a particular achievement I recognised for myself. And then the third thing, as you say, because in the end, although it was difficult, it was very successful, was the reduction in rates of teenage pregnancy, which were part of that broader agenda around supporting young people. And, we didn't know if the rates were going to reduce, and it involved an approach that was very iterative in the sense, and again, that's something that had to be delivered locally. I couldn't control everything from the centre, but tried to give people locally the tools and the wherewithal and the support to try and bring down their teenage pregnancy rates. And it was a tough agenda because obviously we knew that what was driving those rates in some of our most deprived areas were the much bigger social problems of poverty, of deprivation, of underachievement. But nonetheless, we felt it was important to, I suppose, emblematically see that we could do something about teenage pregnancy and what that impacted on in terms of young people's progress. So I cite those three.
Yeah, three incredibly powerful examples and lots to reflect on there. I think the teenage pregnancy strategy is one that we still talk about a lot in terms of that sort of both providing support and accountability to local areas, really to make a difference in what they were doing. If you think now back at, the legacy over the 19 years since you became Children's Minister, a lot has changed in those policies. And a lot of sad decline in terms of Sure Start in particular. What would you like to see, if we see a potential Labour government coming back in terms of learning from the past and what you achieved during your time?
Well, I'm sure that some of the principles of Sure Start that we were implementing then can be further developed. I'm not arguing that we should just go back to how it was, but I think the basic concept. And it's interesting that the government now belatedly, having tried to demolish Sure Start, are now talking about welfare hubs for children and families, which sounds remarkably similar, although not quite so ambitious in terms of their scope. But I think that principle of providing and it has to be a place, I think, providing a place where you can combine the objectives of having really good early education and childcare for very young children, but also with an array of other support for parents in particular and mothers in particular. I'll never forget one woman in a Sure Start centre in London when I visited, who said to me, she said, this experience here, because she'd just got a job, she said, this experience here has enabled my children to see that I am working, and that gives them ambition that they will work, having had a long period of unemployment. And what had happened, and it happened to many people, particularly women, is that they started to volunteer at the centres, and then they'd graduate to being on the reception desk, and then they got plugged in to some training programs, and then eventually they could get work. So, it had a huge impact on so many families, and I would like us to see that principle as something very important that we could reintroduce into certainly those places that need it most, if not nationally.
So thinking about your time in government, can you remember how evidence from research helped inform maybe those policies we've just talked about or other things you did?
I think we were very lucky that with Sure Start, I'll start with that, because that was steeped right from the outset in wanting to understand and implement the evidence base for this approach to the youngest children and families. Having said that, though, I think my abiding impression of the start of our time in government was that the leadership, the Prime Minister and Gordon Brown, right throughout the campaign and right throughout the start of government, argued strongly that we will be a government that uses what works, and that was the phrase. We will use what works, and there was a double message in that. One is that, we will use evidence because that will better implement what we want to do. But it was also a message, I think, for the Labour Party that says we're not going to waste time on trying to implement, ideologies that we think we've always stood for. We're going to see what's practically working for people, and that's what we will implement. So the whole what works culture, I think, was very steeped in the early years of government. That doesn't mean that every Secretary of State and Minister in every department was equally kind of focused on that. But it was there as the kind of umbrella culture of how we were to approach things. And Sure Start, as I said, was really, we were very fortunate with that because we had some really good people working with government that helped us to do that. I mean, Naomi Eisenstadt, who led the programme from the beginning, I don't think herself had an academic background, but she was very close to many leading academics in the field because she's had such a long period of time in important voluntary organisations. We had Norman Glass in the Treasury. He'd come from Trinity, Dublin. And again, he was a civil servant, I think, mainly in his career, but he had a very research-focused agenda. And then, of course, Professor Edward Mellish, who was an academic, and he worked a lot with us and developing the evidence base. So Norman Glass pulled together a group of academics, researchers, civil servants, ministers from across government, not just one department. And they put the nuts and bolts of the policy together for us. So for that policy, research and evidence was very much right at the heart of the start of implementing the Sure Start approach. And as we went on in terms of implementation, how we should go about that. I think teenage pregnancy, it was not so much as I recall. I mean, there was research into teenage pregnancy, but I think we drew a lot there, not so much from pure academic research, but from examples in other parts of the world, particularly the Scandinavian countries, about how they had approached this issue and what seemed to work for them. So it was research of a kind, but not particularly purely academic work in universities. And again, the work on adolescence, we drew a lot from work in other countries as to how to approach that. So that very much informed, the whole approach, the importance of leadership for young people, leadership opportunities, the importance of enabling them to develop resilience, and the importance of what we call positive activities for young people. The kind of enrichment activities that young people from better off backgrounds get as a matter of course from their families. But for many youngsters from more disadvantaged backgrounds, they don't get the chance to do. So all those activities that develop those skills of leadership, of confidence, of resilience, the importance of that for young people's development.
And I guess there's something there about having a broad view of what evidence means, that pairing up of academic research, learning from other countries, data from the ground, professional intelligence, and that insight back from communities, and sort of bringing all of that together. I'm really interested in that sort of overarching principle about what works. And obviously that's something that's really grown. I think at the start of your time, at the end of your time in government was the start of the Early Intervention Foundation and that those kind of what works centres. And many of those programmes that you were leading had evaluation sort of built into them as well, and those sort of feedback mechanisms. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you continued, I guess, using data and learning as things progressed?
Yes, I mean, Sure Start particularly had the National Evaluation of Sure Start, NESS, built it from the beginning. And I think both Ted Mellish and Norman Glass had a role in leading those evaluations. It's slightly risky because I think the first evaluation, that might have been 2005, could not really demonstrate much advantage, certainly to most children, disadvantaged children in particular. But the later evaluations did, I'm glad to say, show a lot of benefit, particularly for disadvantaged children. So I think it's risky. Obviously, it's risky having evaluation, but it's really important that we do it. And I mean, one of the things I remember particularly around the Sure Start, which was, it's very important to learn really. When we made this transition from the centrally driven local programs into programs delivered by local authorities and partners, one of the issues that I tried to hold on to was that they would only be allowed to use validated parenting programs, of which there were 3 at the time, Triple P and a couple of others that you'll probably recall. And I tried to make it a condition of their having the money to develop a centre that they only used those validated programs. And that worked for a while, but then obviously, and this is the problem, isn't it, that the wider you can extend control of implementation, the less faithful very often is the implementation to the research evidence and the principles. And that's what happened with parenting programs, I'm afraid. Not everybody, lots of people who worked in a parenting centre, in a children's centre, felt they'd been a parent themselves and they could deliver their own parenting program. So there was a big pushback from some places not to use the Triple P and the other 2, but to use their own version of parenting programs. And of course, they just didn't work because they weren't faithful to what the evaluations had shown were the important elements of those validated programs. So that's kind of a small example, but it was very telling to me, that it's this balance always in terms of the implementation of policy. You can't just control everything from the centre. It's a big chain from you as a minister in a department out there into a locality. So the potential for you to keep people focused on how things have to be implemented is much more limited. And of course, that's when people step in and do their own thing, and that's when you get deviation from the really robust implementation that you need, and that's when you start to drift away from some of the benefits of those programs.
Yeah, and I think we see that all around the world in lots of these evidence-based programs, that they work fabulously in the initial trials but really struggle to scale for all of those reasons. So I guess then you'll start to think about, well, what other levers have you got to ensure that local areas are sort of doing the best for families? And we spoke a bit about the teenage pregnancy strategy, where that kind of accountability for local areas was a big part of the strategy. And I wonder if you can reflect on, in those instances where perhaps as national government you can't control the detail of what people are doing on the ground, what other mechanisms you used and around kind of outcomes and accountability to try and ensure that local areas were delivering for children?
Well, I mean, I had quite a tussle with some of my officials actually around some of those questions, because having started the implementation of the strategy, we then started to get data around what was happening in different areas, and it was quite clear that some areas were doing much better than others, and we're actually seeing reductions quite early on, and others weren't. Others with quite similar demographics, so we tried to control for that. So I wanted to publish kind of lists of how well everybody was doing, and my officials took in a deep breath and said, "Do you really want to do that, Minister?" And I think they were worried about demotivating. Anyway, we reached a compromise in the end. And we didn't produce everybody so that they could compare them all, but we did produce the achievements of the best, and we tried to use that to incentivize people. And then, of course, we had coordinators centrally. No, I think they appointed them themselves, but we paid for coordinators in every area, and we kept close links and communication with those coordinators so that they could help to focus the people in localities, and it's obviously schools, children's services, voluntary organisations, to coordinate them locally so that they all felt part of the drive to lower the rates in their areas. And I think that coordination was important, but also the link between those coordinators and my officials back in the department, so that we tried to strengthen those links and give those coordinators everything they needed to try and drive improvements.
As I said in my introduction, you've worked at lots of different levels, national government and local government, and then more recently in Manchester. And I wondered if you had reflections on that, about the extent to which you balance using evidence and nationally prescribed programmes with that flexibility to respond to communities and the needs of different places.
As you say, most recently I've been Deputy Mayor of Greater Manchester and responsible for leading for the Mayor, Andy Burnham, the police, crime and fire portfolio. And I will say one of the things that surprised me most when I first began that work, and I was pleased to see it, was the extent to which the police in my area and also nationally try to use evidence as the basis for deciding what to do. And I didn't expect that. But there really was a very strong interest in what research from around the world was showing, and questioning as to how far that would be a useful approach to adopt here. And I think that's positive. I was really, really pleased to see that. As regards the rest of government in my time, as I said earlier, I'm not sure how far other areas of policy were drawing on evidence. I think, and I was there for a little while, I think parts of the Home Office did, and they had quite strong links with criminologists and people working in research, particularly in relation to youth justice, where I had a role for a while. Health, I think, surprisingly less so, but it may be because, health they've got a big scientific community in health looking at the efficacy of medicines and different treatments. And that's very much left to the, I think, medical establishment rather than particularly being a departmental area of focus. So I think it's very varied, Sally, and probably still is.
And can you reflect a little bit, having been a sort of senior minister, about how you balance evidence with other competing priorities? Obviously, when you were in government, that idea of what works was very prominent, so that gave it perhaps a little bit more leverage. But there'll be time when perhaps the evidence doesn't sit well with political commitments or ideology or the media outlet. And how do you balance that as a minister or a senior politician?
I think, and I don't want this to sound at all defeatist, because I never felt defeatist. And you strive to go to the very end of the road that evidence would take you. But ultimately, politics is about doing what's possible at that time and doing the best you can at that time in terms of implementing a policy. And you just have to accept that sometimes you might not be able to take the policy to the ultimate position that research evidence might lead you because of these other constraints. And you just have to kind of accept that. But I think, there have been some really positive achievements in which the weight of the evidence prevailed over the weight of concern about political consequences. And the example I would cite there, and I wasn't responsible for this, but I was very much on the inside of cabinet subcommittees that were discussing it, was the ban on smoking, which Patricia Hewitt, as Secretary of State for Health, led. And there was a really kind of intense discussion, not to say battle, about whether we ought to have a ban on smoking in public right across the piece, or whether that was a step too far in terms of public opinion and public reaction, with other ministers expressing concern that it would reduce, it would affect the viability of pubs, it would impact on all sorts of areas where people actually now smoke or did smoke. But Patricia Hewitt, with support from others like me, Patricia led it. She was just brilliant. And she just stuck to her guns about the evidence on health. And she countered every argument as best she could. And in the end, because obviously in the end it came down to a prime ministerial decision with other ministers, Patricia's view held sway, and we banned smoking in public. And then, you can see almost immediately, but very quickly, the fact of the health benefits of that and the concerns about public reaction just died away. People just accepted it, didn't they? So, that to me was a really profound example of, the benefits of sticking to the evidence-based data and where that's taking you against the legitimate, but in the end, less important arguments about public opinion in that case. It might not always be the case in other examples, but in that case, it definitely was.
And do you think there are lessons from that for academics or campaigners in charities about how to use evidence to support policymakers who are having to fight those battles and make that case?
I don't know if there's any lessons for academics and researchers, except I guess they probably, it would be useful for them to be mindful of that context that can sometimes be there for the policymakers and the politicians. But in general, I'd say not to let that dilute the forcefulness of your argument if the evidence is clear, because actually sometimes politicians do need the forcefulness of the argument in order to counter some of these other contextual concerns, which, as I say, are legitimate, but in the end might not be as important as reaping the benefits for the public of the particular policy that you're thinking about.
So just sort of, reflecting on our conversation and wrapping up, do you think there are things that can be done to strengthen the relationship between researchers, academics and policymakers, locally or nationally, to improve policymaking in the future?
My impression, and it may be that it's a very partial view, so it might not be totally valid, but it's just from my experience, that very much a close relationship between academics and researchers and policymakers and politicians sometimes depends perhaps too much on the happen chance of people knowing each other and of a politician alighting on something and then pursuing it. So I think it's probably worth, what I hope is our next government, thinking more systematically across all sorts of policy areas, how do we need to engage the best of academic research in this particular area, and taking the deliberate steps to do that. As I say, those steps will be taken, but sometimes it's because of individual ministers or individual researchers and the serendipity of them just connecting, you know what I mean? Whereas I think perhaps a more systematic approach by government would be a better way of ensuring that you really are capturing the best of research to inform your policy, and then having more conversations and discussions.
And just as a final question, if you had one lesson from your time as a politician and as children's minister for the next children's minister, what bits of wisdom or learning would you pass on?
Well, as a general point, I'd say aim higher and further than the point you think you want to end up at, because there will always be pressure to pull back. So reach further, reach higher, right at the beginning and persist with that. So that's a kind of more general point about the approach, really. I think despite the undoubted importance of Every Child Matters and Sure Start and some of the work with young people, I still think we've got a situation in this country in which certainly the needs of the youngest children is not adequately recognised across so many policy areas. If you take health, for instance, I've just been doing some work in the House of Lords around health and around budgets. I'm on a particular committee looking at preterm birth and how to prevent it and mitigate the effects. And as part of that, we've had some of the statistics about the proportion of health service money that's spent on the youngest children and on mothers, both in terms of service provision and particularly in terms of research. It's minute, it's minuscule, you know, and I think you can find that in lots of other areas of policy as well. I think we still don't know enough about the kind of context in which young children develop best. And by that I mean we know a lot about how young children develop and what they need, and how it's so important that the quality of the environment that they're in is very high. That makes the biggest difference in terms of progress, particularly for the most disadvantaged children. But I don't think we've done a lot to translate that into, okay, what does that mean for the people caring for young children? What does that mean in terms of how we train people who are caring for the youngest children? And I would like to see in this country, you know, much higher aspirations for the level of qualifications and experience for people who are looking after the youngest children, similar to, you know, some of the Scandinavian countries where it is a very well recognised profession. People are valued, they get trained very highly, and I think that shows itself in terms of the outcomes they get for young children. Similarly, actually, for adolescents, it's the same. I went to Copenhagen and looked there at some of their provision for adolescents, and you know, the people who work with those children are pedagogues. You know, they are highly qualified. They have a great deal of knowledge about how young children and adolescents develop, and they are helped to put those principles into their daily practice, how they interact with that child in that setting. It's so important, and I don't think we're anywhere near that yet in this country, albeit that people who work in that environment are very, very committed, I know, but I don't think we give them nearly enough training and expertise.
Yeah, I mean, two brilliant messages to end on, the need to value children and young people more, and the need to be ambitious for them, and ones that I hope some of the work that we're doing here at PEDAL can help to contribute to. We've got a number of research projects looking at how do we equip those people working with babies and young children with those skills that they need in this difficult environment where they're under-resourced, but also how do we lend that voice to making sure that they're better resourced and better valued in the future as well. Beverley, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and expertise. Before we go, I'd just like to remind our listeners that if you enjoyed listening to this conversation with Beverley, please do check out the other podcasts in our series, which you can find on whichever platform you get your podcasts. And please tell your colleagues about the Mobilise podcast too. Mobilise is a mini-series created by the Centre for Research on Play in Education and Development and Learning here at the University of Cambridge. For more information about PEDAL and to access our wider resources, please visit our website, pedalhub.net. Thank you for listening.